Pray to crash here. Talk to you about something that's really important, something that's been coming up a lot more frequently in the United States media, and that's the Federal Reserve System. I've heard many friends of mine chant the slogan, "End the Fed, end the Fed." And I certainly don't want to become a drone chanting slogans that have little meaning to me. So I decided to take another approach. I was going to find out more about the Federal Reserve System before I made a judgment. Is it really prudent to end the Fed? So what I did was I went to federalreserve.gov to actually read their documents on what the Federal Reserve does. Now granted, there are a lot of them and they're tough to go through. It took a few days, but after finding out enough, I decided to make this video. So, I can break down what the Fed does into about 5 different things. The first thing is they run the national system for check cashing and interbank transfers. Anytime banks need to transfer money between each other, for instance when you write a check and it's cashed by somebody else at a different bank, they have to use this system. Second, and probably most notably, they print money. Frequently they've been printing a lot of it. So any cash and coin issued in the United States has to be issued by the Fed. Also provides monetary infusions for banks. Essentially, anytime the bank needs extra cash, extra capital, the Fed is the one who provides it. Also, as government does, it establishes regulations, a lot of them. So banks have to follow, including transfer regulations, paperwork regulations, capital requirements, any kind of things that the banks have to operate legally. And lastly, monetary policy, which is, of all 5 of the aspects, is probably the one that gets the most press nowadays, since the chairman of the Fed has to actually come out and talk about what the Fed's near and long-term plans and goals are. So the question I ask myself is, what was done before this? The Fed wasn't established. The Federal Reserve System wasn't established until the 30s. So how did the country exist before the Federal Reserve? Well, here's how. Over 150 years ago, banks came together and formed things called clearinghouses. These clearinghouses accomplish many of the same tasks that the Federal Reserve System does now. Interbank transfers, currency issuance, audits for membership, and monetary infusions. So for instance, the National System for Check Cash Interbank Transfers, clearinghouses did this. They would operate as the centerfold for regulating how checks were moved from bank to bank. Any bank within a certain clearinghouse would be able to move money from that bank to another bank. Also, the clearinghouses issued currency. The government would print it, the clearinghouses would receive it, and they would issue it to the banks, or they'd be allowed to print it themselves. Also, they'd print their own currency. A lot of us are a little young now, or even a little old now, to remember traveler's checks. Those were essentially issued currency, redeemable for cash. They also provided monetary infusions for the banks that are in trouble. Now, regarding regulation, the way it worked is clearinghouses had standards for a bank to be admitted into a clearinghouse, meaning they had to be allowed to look at their books and make sure they were balanced. So essentially, they regulated themselves, because no clearinghouse wanted to admit a risky bank. And lastly, monetary policy. Well, they didn't do it. And frankly, I agree they shouldn't have. Because I would argue that monetary policy, loose monetary policy like we've been seeing for the last few years, is one of the reasons that 2008 occurred. So, now I have to think for a second. Should we end the Fed? Well, based on what I've researched, I'd say yes. The Federal Reserve System not only is a hindrance to the U.S. economy, but also has caused a lot of the problems. Many have argued, not just myself, but many esteemed economists have argued that the financial crisis in 2008 that we're still feeling now was a result of our system attempting to correct mistakes made by the Federal Reserve System. Yes, bubbles burst and so forth, but many argue that the Fed precipitated the problem. It didn't help it. Some argue that, well, if we didn't have the Federal Reserve, we'd be even worse shape. Reasonable argument, I can't say because I don't know. But most would agree that had they not acted, we probably would be back out of the recession by now. I don't really know how you can say that we have 0.4% growth every quarter and say that we're in a recovery. Especially when we're printing so much money and the Federal Reserve's balance sheet is now exceeding $1 trillion a year. Pretty impressive, huh? So, in summation, I would say yes, the Federal Reserve System is certainly something we should consider getting rid of because it's mostly a hindrance, especially regarding monetary policy. Why have central planners decide what our economy is going to do? Why not let us decide by how we use our money, what we pay for, what we buy, and how we save? But bear in mind, before I stop this, realize there are 2 results in the Fed will cause, and these are inevitable. The first thing that entering the Federal Reserve System will cause is a slowdown. You're replacing one bureaucracy for another. Now, granted, I always support a private bureaucracy over a public one, but the transfer will cause a lot of headaches and may cause people to lose money. Second, there will likely be another financial crisis. Simple fact is the monetary policy is artificially creating certain situations in our economy. Once you get rid of that artificial work that's being done in the economy, it has to correct itself, and so likely we would see another financial crisis. However, this crisis would be a natural correction, and our country would grow out of it normally. And from then on, we have a normalized economy, at least financially, monetarily, and the country would function as properly. Now, I can't get rid of cronyism and corporatism, but at least if you get rid of the Federal Reserve System, monetarily, we'd be a little bit more stable. But just my opinion. Well, anyway, if you like what you hear, subscribe, leave comments. Hope to hear from you.